like to welcome all of you to Drumlin Farm. We want to thank you so much for coming out on this rainy evening. We truly appreciate all your support of Mass Audubon, and we're so glad you're here. We're also thrilled to have Wayne Peterson as our special guest. Many of you are fans and admirers of Wayne and know him well. Wayne is currently Mass Audubon's Director of Important Bird Areas. Wayne has made an extraordinary contribution to the world of birding over the course of his career. He has reached thousands of people in his lectures and workshops over the past 35 years. He's led tours and trips across America and around the world. And in fact, he has a trip coming up to Iceland this summer, and he's going to Africa next spring. Wayne was a founding member of the Massachusetts Avian Records Committee. He's a past president of Bird Observer. He's a contributing editor to New England Birds and the Christmas Bird Count. He's on the advisory committee for the Stellwagen Bank and the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Committee. And in 2005, he won the Ludlow Griscom Award for his contributions to regional ornithology, and that was given by the American Birding Association. And one of our favorite traits is that he's always patient and generous and kind. When people like me stop him in the middle of somewhere and ask him a question, he's very generous with his knowledge. And last but not least, he is an author. And we're here tonight to celebrate his newest work. It's a beautiful book. It has photography by Brian Small. And when you read the species accounts, if you're like me, you will hear Wayne's voice, and I think you will enjoy it very much. Please give an extremely warm welcome to Wayne Peterson.
Thank you, Leslie. Am I coming through all right? Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. A very warm welcome indeed. And it's always fun to have a chance to speak to groups about birds. And in this particular evening, this is the first time I've had to do a book signing for this newest publication. So I was a little bit uncertain as to the track to take. So this will be probably a little different than a lot of book signings that you may have been to, but the way the presentation was billed, it was to mention a little bit about myself and how I got into birding and so forth and so on, which ultimately led up to the production of this little book. I would tell you, first of all, that the American Birding Association, about 5 or 6 years ago, determined that they wanted to do a series of these books, all of which would have pretty much the same look, feel, format, and so forth, state by state. So they selected appropriate authors to do the various states, and I think they've done about a dozen or so now, and they were not being done in any particular sequence. I think New Jersey and Pennsylvania, Florida, were among the first ones, Colorado. So they jumped around. Arizona, California, Minnesota have been done, I believe. I think they doubled up in the 2 Carolinas. So first and foremost, this is not a unique book, but rather it's one of effectively a series, but they are independent in terms of the sort of sense that each one is state-specific, even though a lot of the pictures and so forth are ones that you may see again, because as was suggested, Brian Small, who is a really fine bird photographer from California. I know Brian, I knew his father, and he's the first, shall we say, the first photographer for the series, so that as the books began to come together, all of the authors were invited to select from a huge library of images that Brian had pulled together. So at the very start of the project, I was given a flash drive with hundreds and hundreds of fine images. And if I didn't find an image that I particularly liked for whatever the species that I was going to be writing about, we were given another half a dozen or so photographers where we could go to their websites online and select images that would do what we wanted to do. So really, it's a project that in many ways showcases Brian Small's photography, because every single one of these books, if they do 50 of them, his pictures will certainly be on display, and some of the images will appear in multiple books. In other words, if somebody happens to like a particular white-throated sparrow, and they're going to include the white-throated sparrow in the book, out of, let's say, a dozen or 15 images of white-throated sparrows, we could conceivably all pick the same one. But the text will be different and so forth and so on. Anyway, that's how the project sort of came together, and it's how I ultimately got loomed into it. But I think more to the point, this is where it begins to kind of veer off the road just a little bit here. I thought it would be interesting, perhaps, and certainly fun for me, in a sense, to just talk a little bit about how I came to be selected for this project, or how long I've been at this. So to start, and we're talking Genesis land here, I have a very badly yellowed, slightly torn newspaper clipping here that says, "Nature sends rare northern bird here." And I'm going to have you wind back 2 name changes ago to something called the Arctic three-toed woodpecker, spotted in 18 areas locally. This article came from the Boston Herald. The name Wayne Hanley, does that turn on lights for anybody? One person, and I won't call anybody else on this. Wayne Hanley was for many years the editor of publications for Mass Audubon. And he was, in fact, the mentor for John Mitchell, who for many years was the editor of Mass Audubon Publications, and who stepped down just about 2 years ago. So that puts this in one context, but I'm going to be more specific. I'm going to tell you that this little sentence or two that I'm going to read came from the October 1956 Boston Herald. And the title of the article alludes to the fact that that was something of an eruption year for what are now called blackback woodpeckers. And intermediate were called blackback three-toed woodpeckers, and when I was a kid, they were called Arctic three-toed woodpeckers. Quote, "Since then, reports have cropped up in 18 communities throughout eastern Massachusetts, with several in Boston suburbs. Best birding seems to be in Wellesley Hills, where Wayne Petersen reported the first bird in mid-October, and Mrs. Philip Holden has seen 2 birds since then." Okay, that was when I was in the 7th grade. Now I'm going to wind you back a little bit further, okay? These flashcards, which some of you may have seen the likes of, or maybe have never seen, were produced by the National Audubon Society seasonally, spring, summer, fall, and winter. There were 50 sets to a box. They were largely painted by Major Alan Brooks, a prominent Canadian bird artist, and then later Louis Agassiz Fuertes provided other images. But these flashcards included the picture of the bird on the front and information on the back. And these were part of what at the time were very popular. And for any of you who've ever seen the old Arm & Hammer baking soda cards, these were like sports cards. They were smaller than these big ones, but they had beautifully painted birds by Fuertes on the front with information on the back, and they were very collectible. When I was very small, that would be smaller than 1956 and in the 7th grade, I had some fairly significant childhood illnesses that kept me in bed for periods of time, and a neighbor gave my mother 4 sets of these things, the 4 seasons. And I was fascinated by these things, and I quickly began to go through and started to learn the names and yada yada. So these cards may have been the touch point for me as far as where my interest in birds first sort of came from. As I got a little bit older, I took a real interest in insects, and we used to have a clothesline that ran from the house out to a clothes post, and I was fascinated by these dragonflies and damselflies that would land on the clothesline. So I was out there with my fly swatter flailing away. We ate a lot of Table Talk Junior pies in those days, and if any of you remember Table Talk pies, they came in little boxes with a cellophane top, perfect for mounting insects. So I would take after we'd eaten the pies, cotton, and my smushed dragonflies and other insects would go on the cotton, and I had stacks of these things. So those were two sort of things that were early on indications that I was clearly, I was a little off center, as it were. And I will just say as an aside, my sister had an equally powerful attraction to horses. So essentially, my folks produced two mutant children because they had absolutely no interest in either of those things. But I will say, in the interest of full disclosure, they were completely supportive of their two mutant children. And I always had a lot of sort of buoying up from below in terms of parental guidance. I also, as was suggested in that newspaper article, I grew up in Wellesley. And I was very fortunate to have had a science teacher in what was in those days called a junior high school by the name of Douglas Sands. And Douglas Sands was a brilliant educator. And he turned on generations of not only young people, but adults in Wellesley, so that growing up, I didn't have to hide my binoculars under my jacket. And I had friends, quite a number of friends, who shared my interest and my passion in birds. And fortunately, that, along with the fact that there was a lot of adult interest in birds, in some cases, I believe the result of the efforts of this wonderful educator, Doug Sands, I grew up in a community that was totally embracing of my interests. So I was very fortunate, and I'm quick to admit and acknowledge all the people and the influences that worked in my direction. So when I was in high school, the Wellesley Conservation Commission and Council was very active, and I knew a couple of adults there who, realized that my enthusiasm for birds was boundless. So I was asked from time to time to write articles for the Townsman, the Wellesley paper. So this was on Wellesley Warblers, and I'm not going to read very much, I'll just read a tad. It says, just about this time of year, that would be now, if you were to leave your automobile and take a little stroll through almost any of our woodlands or shady streets, you would be very likely to hear, high up in the newly foliaged trees, high lisping squeaks and chips. These would, in all probability, be made by tiny, brightly colored mites of birds called wood warblers. So welcome to May. There is one other sidebar that I should mention about this woodpecker, in that it could have chilled everything going forth. If you can think back to when you were 12 or 13, that would be 7th grade, and believe me, I know about those people. I taught middle school for 18 years, 7th grade, life science. So that's a beast, an animal that I know inside and out. So picture this. Mr. Lynch, my 7th grade gym teacher, in the locker room at gym one day in October, said, oh, I understand we have a celebrity in our midst. So the volume, which was sort of suddenly dropped some decibels, and then he said, I understand, Wayne, you found a rare bird. Now I'm looking for a drain hole, a locker to crawl into, because now you could hear a pin drop. And he goes on to register the fact that he had read this article and he knew about this. So that was my 5 minutes of fame, or infamy as it were, because obviously when you're in the 7th grade, anytime anybody singles you out to do anything, that is not a good thing or a good place to be. But I survived, and here I am. So those two little clippings and references I thought were kind of fun, in a sense of just thinking back to, so what gives you the right to write a book like this about, birds in Massachusetts? All right. This, and I have to be very careful of this, this was my Bible. This is a Roger Torrey Peterson Field Guide to the Birds. Roger Torrey Peterson, spelled with an O. I'm Danish, Roger was Swedish. In fact, in 1934, basically wrote the Bible, and we're now how many editions later? But this was my copy that's worn and tattered, and I remember he told me one time at a book signing, he said, I love to see copies of my book or any of my books that look like this, because it means that people have been using them. If they're a bright, spanking new, and the binding isn't even cracked. So anyway, I thought you'd get a kick out of seeing my earliest Peterson guide. So moving forward rather quickly, as we came into the 80s, the Audubon Society Master Guide to Birding was at the time considered the bee's knees. This was the icing on the cake. This was a 3-volume set that included among the first photo guides. You know, up to that point, most bird guides were done by paintings. Many of them, if you wind the clock back far enough, were done by paintings of birds that were mounted. They'd been shot and so forth and so on. But this thing was done in 3 volumes, and I wrote 40-some-odd accounts for this set in the day. So now we're into the 80s. So without, again, going into my complete resume, which I really didn't intend to do, but in 1993, I joined the staff here. In 1988, I collaborated with Dick Veet on a project which indeed is called The Birds of Massachusetts. And this is heavy enough that you could iron a shirt with it or do whatever you had to do. It's a very unhandsome book, other than the fact that Barry Van Dusen did the cover and some illustrations inside in black and white. But it's not a coincidence that the prairie warbler is on the back. I really like prairie warblers. Come full circle if you take a look at the book in front of you. Then I had an opportunity to do another Birds of New England. This was a very weird project, and I won't go into the history of this one, but this was a totally different kind of a thing that involved paintings and so forth and so on. And the co-author was a Canadian fellow who I have never met. I've never had an email exchange with. I've never spoken to on the phone, and yet I'm the first author in his book, what was to be his book. Long story, but it has a happy ending for both of us, I guess. He wasn't unhappy about it. So that was another project. Then, for any of you who are sort of long-standing members of Mass Audubon and seriously interested in birds, you're probably aware that we have done 2 breeding bird atlas projects, one of which was done in the 1970s, a 5-year project that was one of the first of its type in the country that ended up mapping the breeding distribution of birds across the Commonwealth with species accounts and paintings by John Sill. And this was published sometime after the actual field work was done. But nonetheless, it represented a fairly significant effort on the parts of hundreds of people. And I was privileged to have the opportunity to be one of the co-editors of this publication. And then, now we're talking almost real time. In 2011, we finished up another 5-year breeding bird atlas, much of which is done electronically and is available as an app, but we did also produce a hard copy that makes it possible, if you're either using the hard copy or if you look at it on our website in a digital format, comparative maps of the changes in the breeding bird status of all the birds that were recorded in that 5-year period. And I co-authored this with Joan Walsh, co-edited this. So this is kind of a run of how I had the audacity, or why perhaps I was given the opportunity to work on this little book on identification of Massachusetts birds that's part of this American Birding Association series. So enough about that. Let me try to entertain you in a different way here with some of these images. And I will say that any images here are not mine. In fact, there are not a lot of images here, but the ones that I use for the most part are Brian Small's, not surprisingly. It seemed like that was only the appropriate thing to do. Okay, so if you can see that, yeah, that's better. Thank you. Just a few general facts and figures about Massachusetts and Massachusetts birds. First of all, we're really a pretty small state. In fact, we're 44th in size if you start with Alaska at the top and end up with Rhode Island at the bottom. And yet we are the 4th in density of population. So that's a fairly significant kind of contrast if you think about it. You'd think we would be wall-to-wall people, and that's all you'd see in this tiny commonwealth. However, we have a state list that currently sits at 501 species. Now that includes, not surprisingly, a number of birds that have only been recorded once or twice, vagrants and rarities and things, but it nonetheless is really an astounding total when you think of the total numbers of birds. The North American list is 800 and some to change. But that includes, again, a lot of vagrants and things that are out in the outer Aleutian Islands that have come from, Siberia and various places that have only been recorded once. So it used to be that there was a 600 club for people who wanted to see how many birds they could see in the United States, and the goal was to break the 600 barrier. So, 501 isn't too bad for a state the size of Massachusetts. Of these, if you were to look at these two breeding bird atlases, the number of species that actually nest in the Commonwealth is about 200. Okay? And those numbers wobble a little bit based on the time period and so forth, but in a general sort of way, of the numbers 300, 325, 340 some odd that occur annually in the state, about 200 of them nest. The rest of them are either very unusual or they're what we call transients that just pass through on their way to other places. One of the things that makes talking about birds in Massachusetts or studying birds in Massachusetts or makes it feasible to do some of the kinds of things that I've done, or more importantly that others have done, is the fact that we have this very complete historical record. And I've just taken basically from 1900 going forward and included a few benchmarks along the way. Howe and Allen in 1901 did a book called Birds of Massachusetts, very creative boys. Charles W. Townsend did a book on the birds of Essex County in 1905. William Brewster, the first president of this organization and really one of the premier ornithologists of the day at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, did a book on the birds of the Cambridge region in 1906. Edward Howe Forbush, who was the first state ornithologist in Massachusetts, did a magnificent, and to date probably still the most magnificent state bird book done in the country, The Birds of Massachusetts and Other New England States, in 3 Webster Dictionary-sized volumes published in 1925, 1927, and 1929 by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and beautifully illustrated in color by Major Allen Brooks and Louis Agassiz Fuertes. Some of you perhaps had an opportunity to see the program that we held several years ago at the Boston Archives, where all of the original plates for the Birds of Massachusetts that Forbush did are in the possession of the state, and we had a chance to see some of those in the light of day. Bagg and Elliott did a book on birds of the Connecticut River Valley in Massachusetts in the 1930s. Ludlow Griscom and Dorothy Snyder did yet another Birds of Massachusetts in 1955, and that name Griscom will come back again. I'll make further reference to that. And then Dick Veet and myself did the book Birds of Massachusetts. Aren't we creative? In 1993. And then Peterson and Meservey, that's the first Mass Audubon published breeding bird atlas in 2003. And then Joan Walsh and myself did the second one in 2013. And here we are in 2017 with the little book that's on the table up front here. So with this kind of a record, it makes it possible to trace fairly accurately and to say with some precision a lot of things about Massachusetts birds. Certainly, and if one reads this little birds in field guide in the frontal sections, while all of it is somewhat streamlined and necessarily abbreviated, if you think about the changes that have occurred in the Commonwealth since the arrival of the Pilgrims in the 1600s and going forward, there have been some massive, massive changes. And as more and more colonists came our way, clearly the landscape was affected in just dramatic ways. Most significantly is it was cleared, virtually clear-cut in many areas. And that doesn't just mean Massachusetts, it means much of eastern North America in many areas, especially in the Northeast. These large trees, the old growth trees that we revere so much today, these were actually used for housing, they were used for fencing, they were used for firewood, they were used for shipbuilding, they were used for everything. And the purpose for clearing them, in addition to their use, was to make space for the beginnings of agriculture and small subsistence farms and so forth. So if you're a forest bird, if you're something like a northern goshawk, a pileated woodpecker, a barred owl, that likes old-growth forests and big trees, you were seriously put upon as the years rolled on and as more and more people arrived and the landscape was ultimately significantly modified. And this gradual clearing had huge impacts. For example, if you were a grassland bird and you lived in the Midwest in areas that are now completely industrial agriculture, corn, wheat, soy, do the whatever, at the time that those tall grass prairies were occupied by the likes of bobolinks and eastern meadowlarks and upland sandpipers and so forth and so on, woo, the window was open. Suddenly we can move east, because now those forests that were barriers ecologically suddenly became grasslands and open areas that could be colonized. And with all of those birds that I just named, we should add the brown-headed cowbird, which in fact is a brood parasite, as probably many of you know, that lays its eggs in other birds' nests, often at the expense of the host species. So this gradual, almost wholesale modification of the habitat affected lots of birds. And if we go back to the likes of Howe and Allen and Brewster and Forbush, we can see how much more numerous many of those birds were during the early part of time since Western colonization of the United States and Massachusetts took place. The zenith of clearing was in the 1830s, 1840s. So you can imagine how relatively common things that now we're very concerned about their protection and preservation, like meadowlarks, like bobolinks. Every single pair of known upland sandpipers nesting in Massachusetts today nests at an airport. That's because airports are the only place that are big enough and have the right grassland regime to support their requirements. So lots of interesting things happen. Subsequent habitat changes and various other activities have clearly brought about all manner of other impacts that have affected birds. For example, forest succession. All right, so you cut down all the trees and you cut them down for a couple of generations, and then you walk away and decide we don't want to do agriculture anymore. We want to move into the city. That's where the action is. Or we want to move west. That's where the opportunities lie. So all this abandoned farmland and these fields and things gradually through the process of natural plant succession began to regrow into early successional habitats, brushland habitats, and then gradually into secondary and tertiary forests and so forth and so on. So that forest succession was something that made it hard on grassland birds that really didn't want that kind of stuff. And even the early successional, let's say 5, 8 years after a field was abandoned, eventually it's going to be too woody, the trees are going to be too big, and things like my dear beloved prairie warbler and field sparrows and brown thrashers and a lot of those birds that like that early successional stuff, suddenly they're having to look around for new places to live as well. Market gunning and the millinery trade. The millinery trade, if you will recall, our founding mothers here at Mass Audubon, they rose up in concern over what was excessive slaughter of all manner of birds, but particularly the plume birds, egrets, herons, roseate spoonbills, things that had fancy feathers that could be used on women's apparel. So that in 1896, ultimately, through their efforts and getting the attention of the likes of William Brewster that I alluded to earlier, eventually this very organization, the Massachusetts Audubon Society, was established, and it was a rising up of protest against the slaughter of these birds in huge ways. And by the early part of the 1900s, we began to see the first serious legislation to protect birds, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the Lacey Act, some of these other pieces of legislation that were designed specifically to protect birds. There was a creation of large reservoirs and ponds. We really never had common loons nesting in Massachusetts until Quabbin, Wachusett Reservoir, several other larger water bodies in the central and western parts of the state suddenly became big enough that loons would take to these bodies of water. That was also a contributing factor to what is now a very, shall we say, robust population of nesting, permanent resident feral Canada geese. All of these little water bodies and places that were dammed by the colonists and so forth, gradually these things enlarged into ponds, and the next thing we know, we had wetlands all over the place. Fragmentation is something that is a huge problem and an increasing problem. This is where, again, if you think about large unbroken tracts of forested landscape, which you then begin to put power lines through or interstate highways through or subdevelopments in and strip malls along the edges of and so forth and so on. If you're a bird species or other wildlife species, I shouldn't refer just to birds here, that require big, extensive patches, as these begin to get chopped up, that has a very, very adverse effect in many cases, and particularly for ground nesting birds or birds that nest in low bushes, because there are lots and lots of camp followers that are associated with human development. These would be things like raccoons, skunks, possums, household cats, etc. Foxes do very well in that habitat. Coyotes are doing well everywhere, so that a lot of birds now are having a much greater problem trying to nest successfully in these badly fragmented habitats. Things like cowbirds that were never forest birds, now they can get around very nicely because there's edges all over the place. So these are some of the impacts that have clearly over time affected bird species. And then finally, the white elephant in the living room, the 500-pound gorilla that nobody knows what to do anything about at the moment, is climate change. And the changes that are being gradually detected and undoubtedly going to happen in perverse ways, not just to birds, but to all manner of fauna and flora, are taking place at such an accelerating rate that right now we have a team of our science people that are working on yet another State of the Birds document focused exclusively on climate change. And within another few weeks, hopefully you'll all have an opportunity to see what came out of this effort. But these are just a few of the phenomenon that have taken place. And the reason I'm taking the time to talk about these is that in a very simplistic way, I tried to mention and discuss and describe some of these in this little book. Even though it's primarily an identification guide, in the introductory sections there are some pages that specifically address these very problems. So if you want some fairly dramatic examples of species that have changed considerably, in the upper left-hand corner here is the golden-winged warbler. It happens to be one of my favorite 3 species of birds on Earth. It is now essentially extirpated as a nesting bird in Massachusetts. Growing up in Wellesley, when those articles were being written and I was, doing my thing in the fields and woodlands and so forth around where I lived, I could walk to several places where I could dependably find golden-winged warblers every spring. Now they're essentially gone as a breeding bird. In our second breeding bird atlas up there on the table, zippo, none. So that's clearly a species that's declined, and I'm not going to take the time to go into the explanation for why and so forth. But then I would refer you to the eastern meadowlark underneath in the lower left-hand corner, because that species is one that if you look at the 2 maps from the 70s and the 2000s, when we did the same atlas protocol and we made the adjustments for, we were only concerned really with blocks that had them in the first atlas or didn't have them at all, and then suddenly they appeared in the second atlas. It's one of the most dramatically declining species that we've got. And again, it's not a coincidence, it's a grassland bird, which is why we now have a bobolink project. We also have a Forestry for the Birds project that we're working on, working with foresters and landowners to manage woodlots and so forth with birds in mind. But those would be 2 really dramatic examples of species that have declined over time. And then on the right, we have the great blue heron and the Cooper's hawk, and these 2 have just gone ballistic. The Cooper's hawk was always despised. It's a bird hawk. It's one of the ones that's often called a chicken hawk. It feeds largely on birds, and nobody ever liked them. So that unlike bald eagles and peregrine falcons and ospreys and brown pelicans and black-crowned night herons and all these fancy birds that got all manner of assistance, captive breeding, and hacking efforts and so forth and so on, nobody cared about Cooper's hawks. They made it in Massachusetts on their own. So that as the landscape began to change in their favor, and as they were no longer actively persecuted the way they had been, and pesticides that were doing in some of these other big raptors were largely removed from the diet, they have done very well. And of course, with the rise in bird feeding, because they feed heavily on birds, they have learned a trap line. So in the wintertime, if you have a suburban neighborhood with lots of bird feeders, Cooper's hawks and their smaller relative, the sharp-shinned hawk, they're just bouncing around from one yard to the next, picking off a junco here, a mourning dove there. They're doing real well. And in fact, it may be that after the red-tailed hawk, Cooper's hawk may be the commonest hawk as a nesting species in the Commonwealth today. And yet, because they're much more elusive, they're not as conspicuous, they don't sit out on big dead trees along the highway the way red-tails do, they may not be as obvious. The great blue heron, it's all about beavers. As beavers began to come back and began to flood woodlands and so forth and so on, eventually the flooded trees died, and that's exactly what great blues love. They like beaver ponds where they can nest in trees that are in the water, where they're relatively predator-free, and they are no longer persecuted the way they once were, essentially just for sport, because they were big and easy targets. So they have done very, very well too. And again, at some point I invite you to go onto our website, look at the breeding bird atlas maps so you can do the comparison between great blue herons in the 70s and now, and Cooper's hawks now and then, golden winged warblers then, and meadowlarks then and now, because they're fairly dramatic. But the reason, again, I selected these are the sorts of things that in my little species accounts in this book, I've tried, where appropriate, even in only a sentence or two, because that's really, I don't have a whole lot of space to write, to make reference to some of these changes and some of the things that have happened to them and the whys and the wherefores. We also have newcomers that have colonized Massachusetts just within my lifetime and within your lifetimes. The cardinal in the upper left and the tufted titmouse in the upper right. These birds began to appear in Massachusetts in the late 50s and 1960s, and then gradually and steadily, and still their populations make them among the most common songbirds in the state. And yet they were both southern species. Let me return to that southern term again in a minute. The red-bellied woodpecker in the middle here, curiously and maybe coincidentally, one of the first red-bellied woodpeckers to show up in Massachusetts was in my hometown of Wellesley. And in 1958 and 1959, a red-bellied woodpecker was visiting a feeder, 52 Mayo Road, I remember vividly. And bird watchers, while there weren't nearly as many then as there is today, were coming from all over to see this red-bellied woodpecker at this feeder. Red-bellied woodpecker in Ludlow Griscom and Dorothy Snyder's Birds of Massachusetts, which was done in 1955, they described the status of the red-bellied woodpecker in Massachusetts as a rare vagrant from the south, okay? First red-bellied woodpeckers to nest in the state were right in the middle of our first atlas period in the mid-1970s. Today, they range from Mount Greylock all the way to Provincetown. They literally wall to wall. I bet everybody in this room, if you have a bird feeder or if you've got big trees around your house, you probably have red-bellied woodpeckers. And that's just been since the mid-70s that they really exploded. Glossy Ibis, I take a certain degree of pleasure in the fact that I was one of the people that first discovered these nesting in Massachusetts in the mid-70s. There was a sudden northward expansion again of southern herons, great egrets, snow egrets, little blue herons, a lot of these birds, cattle egrets, glossy ibis, all of these things suddenly started showing up as breeding birds. Prior to that, they were somewhat, I won't call them eruptive, but their numbers in Massachusetts were either always very scarce or they would sometimes explode in late summer because after nesting, what long-legged wading birds do, they basically disperse from their nesting colonies, and they disperse like out of a shotgun. They go in all directions. So for many years, in the late summer, after nesting, we would get this influx of things like great egrets and so forth in Massachusetts from colonies to the south. And then come later on in the fall, they turn around, they go south, then the next year they would breed in the south and so on. But for some reason or other, beginning in the 1970s, a lot of these long-legged wading birds, including the glossy ibis, started nesting in Massachusetts. And today, many of them are quite common, locally common in colonies largely along the seacoast and islands and things. The black vulture, 1983 was the first black vulture that we had found nesting in Massachusetts in the Blue Hills. Black vultures now, while there are not a lot of known nesting pairs, they are certainly increasing. The sightings are increasing every year, and there are a few localized places where if you go at the right time of the year, you can see sometimes several dozen black vultures in the air together. And if you trace what's going on in New Jersey and Connecticut and Rhode Island, they're on the way too. Again, southern species. Now let's go back to what I said about climate change. It's very possible, arguably probable, that a number of these southern species that are making these northward advances, these may be the early sort of indicators there's something going on climatically that makes it possible for these once historically more southern warm weather species to be making it northward and continuing. In the case of cardinals and titmice and things, these things are in southern Canada. So it's just one more little piece of evidence that maybe this has been going on longer than we've even realized more recently. So here's some ornithological pioneers, or arguably heroes, each in their own way. And I say heroes, maybe they're just my heroes, but I think they arguably could be perceived for anybody who's interested in birds as heroes. Ludlow Griscom, on the left, was an ornithologist that was at Harvard at the Museum of Comparative Zoology from 1929 until basically his death in 1959. But his great claim to fame was that he effectively was the bridge between what was euphemistically called shotgun ornithology, where you shot something to figure out what it was, and modern day birding, where you can use binoculars or your ears and you can identify something without having to kill it or have it even necessarily in hand. And it was Griscom and his influence that effectively convinced Roger Torrey Peterson in the middle that it was possible to do this. And then Peterson, along with several other sort of colleagues and people about the same time or a little bit ahead of him, realized that almost all birds had recognizable distinguishing characteristics, aka field marks, that could be seen through binoculars and could be used to distinguish definitively one species from another. And Griscom was as Peterson described in his earlier guides in the acknowledgement, Ludlow Griscom was in matters of field identification, was the court of last resort. That is to say, when Peterson ran up against a sticky species or species pair, it was Griscom that he turned to. What do I do here? How do I manage this? So the two of these guys together really set the stage for Peterson's first field guide in 1934, and that was the book that, along with the little Herbert Zim guide, a little blue book about this size with Robbins on the cover, I can remember it vividly, and it was part of a series of guides, everything from mammals and fishes to reptiles and amphibians to stars and rocks and minerals, a hugely popular series of guides. I quickly memorized all the pages in that book and the position. I could still almost tell you which three sparrows were on which page. Scary. I couldn't tell you what I had for breakfast. In any case, ultimately, along came Chandler Robbins, and I say along came. Sadly, Chandler Robbins passed away at 98 about 3 or 4 months ago. He was a brilliant ornithologist. He worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He was based down in Maryland at Patuxent. And he wrote the Golden Guide to Birds, which was that quickly, when it came out, because it included all the birds in North America under one lid, Peterson had to do his. He had an Eastern guide and a Western guide, and he did one for Texas and so on. Robbins pulled them all together under one. Arthur Singer was the illustrator, and that book then became, for many people, sort of the newest game in town. And he also was the one that explored using sonograms as a way to describe or recognize bird songs, as opposed to phonetic descriptions, which is what Peterson did. Sonograms are an electronic registration of what a singing bird sounds like on paper. And with practice, you can begin to figure out by looking at a sonogram what the bird actually sounds like. That, unfortunately, I think was a little ahead of its time in the day. Now it's become a standard technique for studying bird song. But in any case, Chan Robbins, these three guys together, for certainly my generation and maybe a half generation before, were truly pioneers, if not heroes, in terms of what they did for field identification. So eventually we're going to get to the question, so what does my little dumb book have to do with any of this stuff? We'll get there. So there were some milestones during my youth, effectively. These were things that were happening when I was a much younger person. After World War II, there were lots of returning troops who were anxious to get back into birding. Our own James Baird here at Mass Audubon for so many years, who just celebrated his 92nd birthday several months ago. He was in the Pacific campaign, and he was an avid birder, and he was a brilliant ornithologist. So when he came back from the war, he quickly got down to business and ultimately went on to carve out a career of his own in natural history and conservation and ornithology. There were new guides that began to appear. You know, we'd had the Peterson guide, we had the some of the earlier guides before that were at the time still fairly useful, but not as useful as Roger Peterson's Field Guide to the Birds. Richard Poe, the Audubon Landbird Guide, the Audubon Waterbird Guide were two that were very popular. Richard Poe was a very important conservationist for many years. Chan Robbins, we've already mentioned. Sewell Pettengill, he was one of the people that pioneered the whole idea of bird finding guides. So if you're going to travel and you're going to go to an unfamiliar state, he provided directions on how to get there and what sorts of birds you might reasonably expect to see, as well as a nice summary of what was in the state. So again, this was all part of this popularization of birding and bird study, and the numbers of people that were engaged were just swelling, you know, monthly. Bird clubs, a lot of bird clubs that we think of today in Massachusetts were sort of established during this period or a little before. Certainly the Brookline Bird Club is the biggest and the oldest in the state. The Forbush Bird Club, named after Edward Howe Forbush, is sort of based in Worcester County. South Shore Bird Club is based down on the South Shore. And there's a whole bunch of these bird clubs scattered around, each of which has its members, its devotees, its field trip programs, and so forth and so on. Mass Audubon used to offer bus trips. When the headquarters of this organization was not in Lincoln, it was at 155A Newbury Street, downtown Boston. And people who wanted to go on these bus trips would get themselves into Boston. They'd climb on a big Trailways type bus, and they'd go to Newburyport, they'd go to the South Shore, they might go to the Cape, they might go to the Berkshires, and they would have active and keen birders of the day leading these trips. But that's the way things were done, because in the heels of World War II, transportation and gasoline, a lot of stuff was tough, and that's when those things got started, but they continued right on up just about to the point when I was getting started. Obviously, the optics, binoculars, telescopes, these were a huge part of the game. And again, after World War II, there were lots of optics floating around. My first pair of binoculars was a German pair of binoculars that somebody gave me. I guess my father had gotten them when he was overseas or whatever. Opera glasses, you know, little opera glasses and things. People did what they had to do in terms of what was available. But gradually, some of these other brands, Swift, Bushnell, Bausch & Lomb, these came on board. My first real decent scope, and that of many of my colleagues, was the Bausch & Lomb Balscope Senior. They were dark green. You could use them as a baseball bat. You could run over them, but they were optically very, very sharp. And a lot of people still have old Bausch & Lomb Balscopes in their basements that are just as good as the day they bought them, no doubt. And then finally, again, Ludlow Griscom, when he was actively, here in Massachusetts in the 40s and the 50s, he was the guy that really put Mount Auburn Cemetery on the map. He lived in Cambridge. He spent a lot of time birding out here in the Sudbury River Valley, and he spent a lot of time in Chatham on the Cape, where he had ready access to Monomoy, put that on the screen. So again, his birding style and his techniques were ones that I vicariously got because I knew a lot of people when I was younger that knew Griscom or had him as an advisor when they were at Harvard or whatever. So I learned a lot in terms of his style, his knowledge, his expertise. So he was a huge influence here in Massachusetts for many years. So what did all this stuff, how did it affect the notion of identification of birds? Now we're finally getting back a little bit to what this book is about. And the features here are things that they're really not unique or novel, but they're things that to one extent or another in a handbook size little volume I have tried to touch on. The physical characteristics of a bird, what it actually looks like, how it behaves, what it may sound like if it vocalizes, not just songs, but call notes and so forth. What's the time of the year when it's likely to be seen or not seen? If you see a spot-breasted thrush on a Christmas bird count, chances are pretty good it's not going to be a wood thrush at that time of the year. It's probably going to be a hermit thrush. So seasonality alone can sometimes be useful. Habitat, what's the geographical habitat where the bird is found? Some birds are like some people. They're very specific in terms of where they like to live. Some people like to live in cities, some people like to live in the country, and many people like to live in the suburbs. So being specific in terms of habitat and thinking about this as you encounter birds are all points worthy of pondering. And again, I've tried to highlight some of these in this book. So if we take the physical appearance of a bird, since this is kind of the most immediate touch point for most people is when they actually see a bird, they wonder about it. So what's its relative size and shape? Compare it to the objects of known size for comparison. But be careful out there. The concept, bigger than a bread box, smaller than a bread box. Think of a bird that you're looking at and try to look at it, what it's next to, and get a visual sense of that. I mean, is it kind of like the size of the banana that you had for breakfast? Is it the size of the watch strap on your wrist? Is it the size of your wallet? Is it the size of a baseball bat or a golf club? I mean, those seem absurd, and yet they are useful because one of the things that my field guide, and probably any field guide that any of you have ever used, includes is length. What is the length? How big is the bird? We don't tend to think about length very much unless we're thinking about basketball players or athletes or something of that sort. But how tall somebody is or how small somebody is, this is useful stuff. And we're talking about much smaller organisms. Length can be really critical. So think about that, but do be careful because that's one of the easiest places where you can get into trouble in terms of your misperception. One of the things that I think is particularly difficult is how close were you to something? What's the distance away from you? In most cases, most things are further away from you than you think they are. And an interesting reality has to do with birds at bird banding stations. I mean, I have seen on many occasions some very skilled birders, if they are suddenly confronted with a black-polled warbler, in fall plumage in somebody's hand, the first reaction of most people that have never been around birds up close like that is, they look so small. I never realized they were so little. But they look different, not only that. Let the thing go and fly up in a tree. Oh yeah, it's a blackpoll. So that whole difference is something that can be deceiving. Tend to think about things like the head and bill as starters, because bill shape obviously is something that's related to what the birds eat, but it's also very indicative in many cases of what family the bird is in. So think about things like that. And I would add that the shape of the head is similar. Even the feet. Take a look at the bird's feet sometimes. Field marks. Check your field guide. Don't be afraid to use the field guide. That's why you have them. Don't think you can just hold the image in your head. Fortunately, with smartphones now, with cameras, and almost all birders are carrying some kind of a camera with them these days. Take a picture of it. Even if you don't know what something is, shoot first, then go back and look at the picture. Take advantage of that. Observe the bird in different activity modes. Perched, flying, swimming. What is it doing? How is it doing it? Because in many cases, behavior is very distinctive and can be, even at a great distance, behavior can be seen when color features or some of these other more subtle things like the shape of the bill and so forth are not able to be seen. If the bird is feeding, and birds do a lot of feeding, they're feeding constantly, they have to eat more than we do. I know it's hard to imagine, but they have a very high metabolism, and accordingly, are they feeding on berries? Are they feeding on seeds? Are they actively looking for insects and caterpillars? Because there again, that can sort of eliminate, in some cases, particularly for songbirds, whole families of birds based on their dietary preferences. So those are things to keep in mind there. So if you just look at this illustration, and I should add, this is not out of this book. This is something else. But at least it does give you some idea of the variations in the shapes of birds' beaks and bills and feet and so forth and so on. For example, the American coot in the lower right-hand corner, if you see a coot, they're sort of slate gray with a dark head and a white bill, heads kind of bob when they swim on the water, you would assume that they're a duck. Except ducks have webbed feet. That means to say that there's actually connecting tissue between their toes. Coots, on the other hand, have these lobed toes. Their toes are not interconnected. They have these fleshy projections like swim fins along them. Grebes have the same thing. Loons, on the other hand, have webbed feet, big, huge paddle-like webs. Woodpeckers are interesting. Their toes, instead of 3 facing forward, 1 back, they have zygodactyly, which means that they can swing 1 toe around so they can get maximum gripping on the side of a tree trunk, 2 front, 2 back, as opposed to 3 up and 1 back. So things of that sort can be interesting to notice. Raptors, like the peregrine there, obviously have talons that are strong and powerful for gripping living prey and so on. So think about those things when you see a bird and get an opportunity to see it really well, because in many cases you can use those features as subtle indications of what it is. So what it's doing, is it perched? And if it is it perched up on the tippy top of a tree on a dead branch? Or is it perched sort of midway down the tree? Is it perched in the middle of a tree? Is it perched on the ground and hopping along on the ground? I was talking about Cooper's hawks earlier and the fact that I said they're kind of sneaky and they're not like red tails. Red tails will sit right out bigger than life with that big white chest, and you can see them like a beacon a mile away even when you're driving. Cooper's hawks invariably are much more inclined to sit in the middle of a tree, closer to the trunk. They don't want to be seen because theirs is a sneak attack approach to foraging. Red tails are content to drop down on a squirrel or a mouse or a rabbit or whatever, and they can just sit up in a tree and watch. Coopers are looking from inside a tree. They'll shoot around the corner of your garage and take a dove before the dove even knows that it's there. I would not want to have a Cooper's hawk as a friend, if you get my drift. They are sneaky birds, and they're good at what they do. Watching how birds move. Watch grackles, starlings on your lawn. They walk. Robins, on the other hand, will run or they'll hop. They'll keep their feet together. Eastern towies, fox sparrows, when they're scratching the leaves, they jump with both feet. That's why they make so much noise and the leaves are flying. They're literally taking their feet off the ground at once and kicking the leaves back. That behavior is something that can often put a bird into a family. If you're watching a water bird, a bird that's swimming, is it tipping up and obviously getting its food off the bottom in shallow water, or is it completely diving under the water, like a loon or certain types of ducks? But not all ducks do that. So that kind of behavior can be important. These other sorts of things are kind of fun to watch. If you have phoebes around your house or nesting under your house like I do, they're constantly pumping their tail. They land and they immediately start to pump their tail up and down. That's a very distinctive feature. Phoebe could be sitting on a wire, backlit with the sun, but that sort of big-headed look and the pumping of the tail, absolutely diagnostic. Wing flicking, kinglets, little tiny things, constantly flicking their wing, nervous, twitchy little things. Head bobbing, I mentioned the coot swimming. bobbing its head as it swims. Gallinules do the same thing. In flight, woodpeckers very typically have this very decided undulating flight. They close their wings right up close to their body, and they sort of swoop down, and then they do this kind of thing. Goldfinches kind of hiccup along and have this sort of bounding flight. Warblers have a very darting flight when they're flying from tree to tree in open air. In terms of some of the hawks and things, little American kestrels, little helicopters, they kind of hang out over a field and then drop down on grasshoppers and things from the air. Red tails, big, lazy, soaring circles up high in the sky. These are all features that are distinctive and with practice can be used to good advantage, often at a great distance. Here's 3 warblers, for example, since we're right at the heart of warbler migration right now. Black-throated green warbler on the left. These are very active warblers. They tend to forage out near the edges of branches of trees, and they very often move from one tree to another with some frequency. Other warblers may spend a lot more time, more patiently foraging in one tree. Black and white warblers, like the one in the middle, they're like nuthatches. They creep around on the bigger limbs and the trunks. They use their beak to poke into the little crevices in the bark for insects and insect larvae. Very different type of strategy than black-throated green. The Louisiana water thrush, it's a little hard to see here, but these guys walk on the ground, usually along the edge of a running brook, a stream side, and they constantly bob their tails slowly, not pumping it like a Phoebe. And there's 2 of these water thrushes, and the habitat is different. For the Louisiana water thrush, they tend to like brooksides and streams with running water. Northern water thrushes like dank swamps, boggy swamps, swampy woods, nesting in, like overturned stumps and that kind of thing. So these would be differences in foraging behavior for just 3 different types of warblers. And you could extend that out. We got about 35 species of warblers. Each one has its own subtly different way of getting food. Through the seasons, obviously bird life changes. I've tried to indicate, both in a table in the front, just a few little concepts about what the seasonal highlights month by month are, and some of the places where particularly appropriate to visit in the wintertime or in the spring or in the summer and so forth. Remembering that spring at this time of the year is a migration season, but a lot of birds are already beginning to nest and already starting to fledge their young, at least in a first brood. Summer is basically a nesting season, and it's also the season when lots of birds molt. That is to say, they replace their plumage, and many times they take on a different appearance. If it's one where the adults are different from the young, or if they have a breeding and a non-breeding plumage, summer, late summer is the time when they gradually make those transitions. Fall is the season of the year when there are more birds around than any other time of the year, and that's because you've got that year's summer patch amongst the population. A lot of those will unfortunately succumb in their first few weeks or months of life. Many of them will not survive their first migration, so that by spring, the population is down from what it was several months before during fall. And for the ones that make it through the first fall migration, they might very well get into trouble in the winter, because the winter is obviously a very challenging season for many birds as well, in terms of how much snow there is or how cold it is, or whatever, if it's waterfowl with ice on freshwater ponds and so on. So now we come to the question, what gives me the audacity to think that I could write or build a better mousetrap? Well, I won't say it's a better mousetrap, but these are some of the things that I think this new little guide may have a functionality to it, that whether it be the one from Massachusetts or any of the other states that eventually will come online. The fact that they are state-specific is useful. In other words, the commentary, the text portions in all of these guides is devoted specifically to the state that it's featuring, as opposed to being generic in terms of talking about the birds. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some generic comments and things that are tied in there, but basically they are as state-specific as can be, and hopefully that would give them some added value. They only have, in the case of this one, 248-ish, about 250 species. And those are the most likely to be encountered species, the ones that are the most common. It's not all of them. For example, the king eider isn't in there. but you can be sure the common eider is. I use that one as one. King eider is one of those that's right on the cusp of should I or shouldn't I have put it in the book. I figure for most people, they're probably never going to see a king eider. But some people are, and they'll have to go somewhere else to get a picture of a king eider.
Tricolored heron.
Tricolored heron, that's another one that's, you know, on the cusp. That's one that could or couldn't go. I would like to think that the book does offer useful information not only to newer birders, but also for more experienced birders who may just be visiting the Cape for a week in the summer or something, and they're just not familiar with Massachusetts. Some of the information in the text hopefully will provide some indication of how common the bird is, where some of the better places to see it might be, and so forth and so on. As well as what kinds of habitat, where would one look for a particular species? What sorts of environment would that include? Now again, remember, it's a small book, but I dare say that in looking at some of the others in the series, they do pretty well manage to capture enough information that somebody who's serious can put that to good work and can hopefully help them find what they want to find or get to know what they need to know. I can't say enough about the photos. Brian Small is a superb photographer, as are the few others that I drew some pictures from other sources, but they're high quality. They don't include every plumage. They don't include every, in some cases, even every gender, but they are hopefully enough that they would be of some significance to most people. So a lot of the tedious identification detailing that you find in some of the more enlarged field guides isn't there. And most of the ID information is provided under the captions of each picture, not so much in the text. The vocalization, the sounds, no sonograms in this one, and the vocalizations are pretty standard. That is to say, they don't include every sound that a bird is likely to make, but sort of the most traditional. The song, if it's a songbird, is usually described in some way, and if there are particularly significant notes that are quite distinctive, you know, the squeak of a rose-breasted grosbeak, for example, that kind of thing would be in there. In the back, there is a complete checklist of Massachusetts birds. It's not annotated in any way, but it is the Massachusetts Avian Records Committee checklist that has 501 species on it at the time that I pulled that together. So you can use that as a checklist. And then it gives these little monthly profiles for birding in Massachusetts in the front. That's one of the features that's in the frontal section. So be careful out there. There are caveats to this business of identification. This book is not going to be, not going to have all the answers for sure. Be aware of some of the other sorts of things that can sometimes affect your perception, such as the effect of light, fog, molt. If a bird is in transition, unlike Superman, they can't just step into a phone booth and, you know, it takes so when a bird is in the process of changing, when you see a scarlet tanager that's red and green with black wings, it's obviously molting from its red to its yellowish non-breeding plumage or whatever. Be careful when you're on a boat. Glare can be a big problem over water. Recognize plumage anomalies. Some of these terms like leucism, which is sort of a bleaching out, a whitening of the plumage when there's certain pigments lacking and so forth. Albinism. Feather lice. We get lots of calls at Mass Audubon in the summer with these black-headed cardinals. Cardinals, for whatever the reason, possibly because they have a crest, seem to be particularly prone to damage to their feathers by feather lice. And cardinals have black skin, so that when they lose the feathers on the head, they look like they have a golf ball, a black golf ball for a head. But there you go. There you go. So that's just something to be aware of as well. And a lot of this stuff is the sort of information that, you know, you build up gradually. As I said, I've been at this since I was little, so I've had the opportunity to pick up some stuff along the way, but it's all fun. A white turkey? Cool. Yeah. I'll tell you, there's an albino, a pure albino black vulture that's kicking around in the southern Berkshires right now. And I have seen pictures of this thing, and it is just gorgeous. I mean, it is an absolute... Albinism, by the way, just to clear the air here, albinism is very much like pregnancy. to the extent that you cannot be a partial albino any more than you can be partially pregnant. If a bird has patches of white or is pale, it's not an albino. If it has pink eyes and all the soft parts like the bill and the legs are pink and there's not a trace of any other dark pigmentation, it's an albino, period. If it's not that, then it is showing one of various other plumage anomalies that have to do with pigmentation and lack of pigmentation and so forth. And leucism, that I show that word there, Leucism, is one of the primary examples of that. So we've come full circle. The only thing I want to do quickly, if we have a minute, we can put the lights back on if that's okay, and I will I'll certainly take some questions, but I thought it might be fun just so you, since you guys don't all have a copy in front of you yet, I just thought I'd read a couple of accounts just to give you a sense or a flavor of what it's about. So I selected several here. One of them is the long-tailed duck, the one that used to be called the old squaw. So each species has, in addition to the common name, it has the Latin scientific name underneath. It has the length, and it also has the wingspread for birds like waterfowl. So the garrulous, active, and dapper long-tailed duck is an abundant winter visitor, especially in the waters around Nantucket Island, where a major percentage of the eastern North American population often spends the winter. Not arriving in numbers until late fall, fast-flying, twisting flocks of long-tailed ducks are readily observable passing coastal headlands such as Andrews Point or Manamet Point. And I would mention that in the front there is a map. The front paper includes a map that has a lot of the places that are mentioned in the text specifically identified, but you might need a magnifying glass or something. The text is small. Flocks regularly linger at spring staging areas such as Newburyport Harbor until mid-May. Once this species was spuriously named Old Squaw because of the constant gabbling calls of the males, not the females, exclamation point. To best appreciate these vocalizations is to listen to the flocks of thousands that daily pass Nantucket Island on a winter afternoon as they commute from feeding grounds on the Nantucket Shoals into Nantucket Sound for the night. The three-part yodeled call of the male longtail has a yelping quality, especially when many are heard at a distance. And then there are the captions include some of the field ID features. Here's another one that I know you'll love, only to the extent that we just mentioned it. This is the wild turkey. Of the bird species regularly occurring in Massachusetts, few have made a more dramatic recovery following extirpation in the 1800s than the wild turkey. After a series of marginally successful repatriation efforts beginning in the mid-20th century, the species eventually took hold, and today this Thanksgiving icon is commonly distributed from the Berkshires to Cape Cod, where it occupies habitats ranging from cities to suburbs and forests to barrier islands. Wild turkeys are likely to be encountered practically anywhere in the state, including highway roadsides, forest edges, and in any localities where wild birds are commonly fed. The gobbling of male wild turkeys is often heard early on May mornings, and the varied clucks and chuckles of females are uttered throughout the year. Common loon, another favorite sort of iconic bird for any of you that spend time in the northern lake country. The common loon is a very common and local breeding bird in a very uncommon and local breeding bird in central and western Massachusetts, confined mainly to large lakes such as the Quabbin and Wachusett reservoirs. Most common along the coast in winter and during migration in late fall and mid-spring. Loons are also regularly seen inland passing high overhead or when they tarry on large ponds and lakes before resuming their migration. Modest numbers of subadult loons spend the summer on the ocean in Massachusetts, sometimes well offshore. The thrilling wails and yodels of this species are mainly confined to breeding lakes. However, a rapidly trebled laughing call is often heard in migration or along the coast in winter. American woodcock. Who doesn't love woodcocks? Who does not love woodcocks? Okay, the American woodcock is a widespread and common upland shorebird, and with the Wilson snipe is still the only legally hunted shorebird in North America. Arriving in early March, male woodcocks initiate courtship almost immediately. Hidden in moist thickets during the day, The males seek clearings in adjacent brushy fields at dusk, where they begin uttering a nasal, buzzy note, which is eventually followed by an aerial display accompanied by a soft wing twitter and vocalizations resembling a child's bubble pipe. Though a few attempt to overwinter, most woodcocks depart by November. Woodcocks are easiest to locate in early spring when the males are displaying. Good places to find them in eastern Massachusetts include Ipswich River Wildlife Sanctuary, Daniel Webster Wildlife Sanctuary, and the Crane Wildlife Management Area. So this is the way that the accounts read. I'll just give you one or two others. Since this is our only federally endangered species that nests in Massachusetts, I would be remiss not to mention the roseate tern. The elegant roseate tern is a federally endangered species that maintains a major percentage of its Western Hemisphere breeding population in Massachusetts. With only 3 major nesting sites in the state, this species is the target of significant management efforts. Though closely resembling the common tern in many respects, in breeding plumage, the roseate tern's black bill, long tail streamers, and distinctive calls help distinguish it. With shallow, choppy wing beats and very white wingtips, with less black showing than the common tern, with practice, rosies can often be picked out at a distance. In August and early September, a major portion of this species' northwest Atlantic population gathers on the outer beaches of Cape Cod before heading south. Hatches Harbor in Provincetown, Nauset Beach in Chatham, and Nantucket are easy places to see them in late August and early September. The call is a squeaky chirrick or chirreep, also a harsh zap, like the tearing of canvas. I'll give you one more. Do you want the Carolina wren, or would you like the prairie warbler? All right, since that's my favorite, one of my favorites. That's the cover bird. You knew I'd pick the prairie warbler. The prairie warbler is a brightly colored, tail-pumping, locally common breeding species closely linked to early successional habitats, powerline cuts, and especially the pine oak barrens of southeastern Massachusetts and Cape Cod. Arriving in early May and departing by early October, local populations are ephemeral due to their dependence on the shrubland habitats that are constantly changing due to natural succession. The Montague Plains, Miles Standish State Forest, and the Crane Wildlife Management Area are excellent localities to find nesting prairie warblers in early summer. Song is a high, thin, rapidly delivered z-z-z-z-z-z going up the scale. Running up the chromatic scale, note is a flat chip. There you have it. Questions? Happy to take any. That was easy. Yes?
Why is the prairie warbler your favorite personally?
Well, I happen to live in southeastern Massachusetts. I live on the South Shore, and I'm particularly keen on pine barren habitat. I mean, it's an interesting environment because botanically it has a lot of interesting stuff. There are a lot of interesting butterflies there, and prairie warbler is so closely associated with these habitats. All I have to do is see a photograph, and I can tell you, yeah, that's going to have prairie warblers there. It's that kind of thing. And I would suggest that, as I mentioned earlier, that taking advantage of habitat and the birds that are found in association with, in other words, if you encounter a new species, take a look around. What's the environment like where you saw it? Is there anything distinctive about it? What other birds did you see at the same time? So that even that, if you see a prairie warbler, there's a good possibility you could be hearing a field sparrow off somewhere too. So if you hear a field sparrow, I should be thinking about the possibility of prairie warblers, or there's a brown thrasher singing, because some of these birds are very, very habitat specific. So it's easy to plug in the cast of characters once you sort of get a handle on these things. Yes?
Did you do much research, or do you basically know?
That's a tough question to answer. The question, if you didn't hear it, was, did I do much research or do I know? If you talk about my life, yes. For this book, I didn't have to do a lot of research. That is to say, because as I described at the front end of this, sort of my evolution as an ornithologist and somebody really interested in this stuff, it gradually just became here. But no, certainly there are things that I have a library that is frightening. I mean, I have a house basically to accommodate my library. So that in that collection of books through the years, I have certainly done research, and I've spent, I mean, one of the things I tell people is every time you raise your binoculars, make it count for something. Don't just make it count for, oh yeah, that's another warbling vireo, or that's a blue-headed vireo, or that's a common. Try to just take a moment and what are you getting from that? Okay, if it's a warbling vireo and if it's along the Concord River in those silver maples at Great Meadows Refuge, make note of that. So next time you see a river with big silver maples, this is a good place for warbling vireos, because it is, because they're all over the place. And once you kind of get a handle on that, if you go to Mount Auburn Cemetery, you go to what I like to call the Spectacle Pond, there's going to be warbling vireos there. They're around the edges of the pond. So that kind of stuff is stuff that, yeah, you can get that out of books, but personal experience, repetitively and thoughtful looking, is in the long run going to take you further. It's like learning bird songs and learning to spell. You know, I can remember how many times teachers and my parents, everybody, how do you spell? Look it up. You hear an unfamiliar song, you could ask somebody, yeah, that's a warbling vireo. I remember my first warbling vireo, and I remember how long it took me to get a look at the darn thing, and then I was sorry after I spent all that time looking at it. They don't look like much, but they certainly sound nice. So, any other questions? Yes?
Could you talk just a little bit more about that albino vulture in terms of, is it compromised in terms of finding a mate or reproducing, or?
Well, it's hard to know, but probably, yes. Compromised in terms of its ability to eat carrion and so forth, probably not. But anytime anything is that extreme, there are going to be issues, especially, I saw some pictures earlier this spring that somebody showed me of an albino double-crested cormorant, which, again, curiously, is essentially an all-black bird. When it's all white, it's whoa. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that it is. How compromised, hard to tell. I mean, human albinos, obviously, they have visual issues because they don't have any pigmentation in their eyes, so that's a problem. Their skin is very sensitive to sunlight, that kind of thing. One of the things that melanin as a pigment does for feathers, it gives them strength. In other words, from an organic chemical molecular structure, melanin is a much stronger molecule, so that a lot of white birds have dark wingtips. Many gulls have dark wingtips. You know, white ibis have dark wingtips, white pelicans, wood storks. It's thought that one of the things that the black in their wingtips or their wing feathers, the outer wing feathers, does is give them strength, because those are the high stress points. So for a bird that is essentially all black, other than having white wingtips like a black vulture, I'm sure that it is compromised. But on the other hand, it's a big bird, and there's not much that's going to bother vultures. I mean, who wants to eat a vulture? Think about it. So it's hard to say what its long-term future prognosis will be. The one thing about either leucistic individuals that have some degree of white or whiteness, or maybe just patches of white, and albinos is they're easy to track. You know, if they show up, people are going to recognize them and say, oh, I've seen that bird before, or you know. So at least in some cases, it's actually easier to know how long a bird like that will survive than a normal individual, because in most cases you can't distinguish one individual from another. You know? Anything else? All right, well then, thank you very much. I appreciate it. We're just about, it's 8:29. That's great. Thanks.